Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the New Horizon and watched the stars shift across the view screen. His ship floated between two massive fleets that wanted nothing more than to destroy each other. The Zarakian warships gleamed red and black on the left side, while the Meridian vessels shimmered with soft blue lights on the right. Between them sat his small diplomatic ship, the only thing preventing another bloody battle in a war that had already claimed millions of lives. Lisa Hamilton turned from her communication station and gave Jake a tired smile. She had been translating angry messages between both sides for the past 6 hours, and her voice was starting to crack. Ryan Brooks stood near the tactical display with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. He did not like being this close to so many weapons without any real defenses of their own. But this was what Earth did now. They stood in the middle and tried to make everyone talk instead of fight. The year was 2387 and Earth had become the galaxy's neutral ground. For 50 years, humans refused to pick sides in any conflict. They did not claim territory beyond their own colonies, and they did not build massive war fleets like other species. Instead, they built hospitals and trading stations and diplomatic vessels like the New Horizon. Other species thought humans were weak or foolish or both, but they also needed someone who would not take sides, and Earth was the only species that seemed to genuinely want peace. Admiral Claire. Williams sat in her office on Earth and reviewed the latest reports from Jake's mission. The Zarakians were getting more aggressive with each passing month. Their Supreme Commander Thex Val had sent 3 messages in the past week, demanding that Earth stop protecting Zarakian enemies. Claire did not see it that way. Earth protected refugees and provided medical care and facilitated peace talks. That was not the same as choosing sides. But try explaining that to a species that only understood strength and conquest. She looked at the image of Thex Val on her screen. The Zarakian commander was massive even by his species' standards, with dark scales and eyes that burned with constant anger. He had personally led the destruction of 4 different civilizations and wore their symbols as trophies on his armor. He thought Earth's neutrality was weakness, and Claire knew he was testing them, pushing boundaries to see when humans would finally break. President Helen Martinez had made Earth's position very clear. No wars, no exceptions, no matter what. Helen believed that the moment Earth picked up weapons and joined the fighting, they would become just another violent species scrambling for power. Claire understood the reasoning, but she also saw the reports that people like Helen never read. The reports about entire populations being wiped out while Earth stood by and watched. The reports about species begging for help that never came. The reports that kept Claire awake at night. On the frontier colony of New Geneva, Commander Alex Turner walked the perimeter of the settlement and checked the defense systems that were not supposed to exist. Officially, Earth colonies had no military installations. Officially, they were protected by treaties and galactic law. But Alex had been a soldier before he became a colonial administrator, and he knew that treaties only worked when everyone agreed to follow them. So he made sure the mining lasers could be redirected quickly, and the cargo shuttles had armor plating that seemed a bit too thick for civilian use, and the communication arrays could jam enemy sensors if needed. Kate Anderson joined him at the eastern wall and handed him a data pad. She was his security chief, and she shared his concerns about the Zarakians. The pad showed another incident report. 3 days ago, a Zarakian patrol had buzzed a civilian transport and fired warning shots across its bow. 2 days ago, they had boarded a human cargo ship and confiscated medical supplies destined for a Meridian refugee camp. Yesterday, they had established a listening post just outside New Geneva's space without asking permission. Each incident alone could be explained away, but together they formed a clear pattern. The Zarakians were preparing for something. Dr. Nathan Ford did not think much about politics or military strategy. He was too busy trying to save lives. His medical station on Kepler 442b had been designed to handle maybe 50 patients at a time. Right now he had 300, and the refugees kept coming. Most were Meridians fleeing the Zarakian advance. They arrived in damaged ships with radiation burns and malnutrition and injuries from weapons that Nathan had only read about in war crime documentation. His assistant, Amy Chen, worked beside him in the overcrowded medical bay. She had gentle hands and a soft voice that helped calm the frightened refugees. Many of them had watched their families die and their cities burn. They came to the human medical station because Earth was neutral, because Earth would help anyone regardless of which side they were on. Amy believed in that mission with her whole heart. She believed that saving lives was worth any risk. Ambassador Keth Knoll of the Meridian Coalition sat in the waiting area and watched the human doctors work. His people were dying, and Earth was trying to save them one patient at a time. It was noble, and it was kind, and it was completely insufficient. The Zerakians were not interested in peace talks or diplomatic solutions. They wanted the Meridian homeworld for its rare minerals, and they wanted the Meridian people gone. Keth Knoll had tried to explain this to every human official who would listen, but Earth's government kept insisting on neutrality and process and giving peace a chance. Back on Earth, Marcus Stone sat in the intelligence headquarters and watched patterns emerge from the data. He was good at seeing connections that others missed. The Zerakian fleet movements over the past 3 months told a clear story if you knew how to read it. They were consolidating forces, pulling ships from patrol routes and massing them near the Meridian homeworld. Supply lines were being shortened, and diplomatic communications had dropped to almost nothing. Every indicator suggested that the Zerakians were preparing for a final assault. Marcus had sent his analysis up the chain of command, but the response had been disappointing. The diplomatic corps insisted that negotiations were still possible. The military advisors said Earth's neutrality must be maintained. The politicians worried about setting precedents and starting conflicts. Nobody wanted to believe that sometimes talking was not enough. Jake Morrison ended another failed negotiation session and rubbed his tired eyes. Both sides had retreated to their respective fleets without any progress. The Zerakians demanded complete Meridian surrender, and the Meridians could not accept extinction. It was that simple and that impossible. Lisa shut down her communication systems, and Ryan stopped analyzing tactical data because what was the point? They would be back here tomorrow doing the same thing with the same lack of results. The galaxy watched Earth's diplomatic efforts with mixed feelings. Some species admired human persistence and principles. Others thought humans were naive children playing at galactic politics. A few wondered what would happen if Earth ever stopped trying to keep the peace and started trying to win a war. But those were just whispers and speculation. Earth had not fought a real war in 50 years and showed no signs of changing course. On the Meridian homeworld, families gathered in their homes and tried not to think about the Zerakian fleet growing larger in orbit. Children asked questions their parents could not answer. The humans were trying to help, their parents said. Earth would find a solution, they promised. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. Help was not coming fast enough, and solutions required time they did not have. Supreme Commander Thex Val looked at his battle plans and smiled his predatory smile. The Meridians would fall within weeks, and Earth would do nothing but send strongly worded messages and offer to take refugees. Humans talked about principles and morality, but in the end they were soft. They had forgotten what it meant to fight for survival. They had grown comfortable in their neutrality. That would be their downfall and his triumph. The Zerakian Empire made its first official demand 3 weeks after the failed peace talks. Supreme Commander Thex Val sent a message directly to President Helen Martinez that was not a request but an ultimatum. The Zerakians wanted exclusive trade rights through all human space, and they wanted permission to establish military bases on 3 of Earth's outer colonies. They gave Earth 48 hours to respond. Helen sat in the cabinet room with her advisors and read the demand twice to make sure she understood it correctly. Admiral Claire Williams stood near the window with her hands behind her back and her face carefully neutral. The Secretary of Commerce looked nervous and the Secretary of Defense looked angry, but everyone waited for Helen to speak first. She set down the datapad and looked at each person in the room. Earth had maintained its neutrality for 50 years by never giving in to threats and never responding with violence. That was not going to change today. The response Helen sent back was polite and firm. Earth would not grant exclusive trade rights to any species, and would not allow foreign military bases on its territory. Human space remained open to all peaceful vessels and closed to all military aggression. The message ended with an offer to host new peace talks between the Zerakians and Meridians at a neutral location. Helen knew the offer would be rejected, but it had to be made anyway. That was how diplomacy worked, even when diplomacy was failing. Commander Alex Turner received an encrypted message from Earth's Defense Coordination 40 minutes after Helen sent her response. The message was brief and used code words that meant prepare for possible hostilities without actually saying it. Alex called Kate Anderson to his office and they began quietly updating their contingency plans. The mining lasers were tested and certified as operational. The cargo shuttles received sudden scheduled maintenance that included checking their armor plating and engines. The communication arrays ran diagnostics that happened to include their jamming capabilities. To any outside observer, New Geneva was simply running routine checks, but Alex and Kate knew better. Kate reviewed the latest Zarakian movements near the border and did not like what she saw. More ships had arrived in the past week, and they were conducting aggressive patrols that came closer to human space with each pass. Yesterday, a Zarakian destroyer had locked weapons on a civilian transport for 30 seconds before breaking off. The transport crew reported that the Zarakian commander had been laughing on the open channel. Kate had heard recordings of Zarakian laughter before, and it always sounded like someone was planning to hurt. Dr. Nathan Ford worked through another endless shift at the medical station and tried not to think about the growing danger. His facility was clearly marked with medical symbols and protected under every galactic law that existed. But laws only mattered when people followed them, and the Zarakians had shown repeatedly that they did not care about rules. Amy Chen shared his concerns, but neither of them talked about leaving. The refugees needed help, and running away was not something either of them could do. Ambassador Keth Knoll arrived at the medical station with another group of survivors, and the stories they told made Nathan's blood run cold. The Zarakians were not just conquering Meridian territory anymore. They were systematically destroying anything that made Meridian culture unique. Libraries were burned, artists were killed, historical sites were demolished. This was not war, it was cultural genocide. Keth Knoll begged Nathan to contact Earth's government again and explain what was really happening. Maybe if they understood the full horror, they would finally act. Nathan sent a detailed report to Admiral Williams that included witness testimonies and medical evidence of atrocities. He did not know if it would make any difference, but he had to try. Claire read his report late that night in her office and felt something cold settle in her chest. She had seen war before, had fought in Earth's last conflict 50 years ago before the neutrality policy took effect. She knew the difference between military operations and deliberate cruelty. What the Zarakians were doing crossed every line that separated soldiers from murderers. She took Nathan's report to President Helen the next morning, along with intelligence summaries from Marcus Stone and incident reports from Alex Turner. Claire laid out the evidence methodically and without emotional appeal. The Zarakians were preparing for a final assault on the Meridian homeworld. They were testing human resolve at the borders. They were ignoring protected medical facilities and threatening civilian transports. Earth's neutrality was being interpreted as weakness, and the Zarakians were pushing to see how far they could go before humans pushed back. Helen listened to everything, and then sat in silence for a long time. She had built her career on the principle that violence only created more violence, and that Earth's moral authority came from refusing to participate in the galaxy's endless wars. But she was also responsible for protecting human lives and maintaining the values that made Earth worth protecting in the first place. Could you claim moral authority while standing by and watching genocide unfold? Could you protect your own people by doing nothing while predators learned that humans would never fight back? Jake Morrison docked at the Meridian homeworld and immediately saw how bad things had gotten. Zarakian ships filled the orbital space, and their weapons were aimed at the planet below. The Meridian Defense Force was tiny and outdated and completely outmatched. Jake's diplomatic credentials got him through the blockade, but just barely. Lisa Hamilton handled the tense communications with Zarakian patrol ships that seemed eager for an excuse to fire. Ryan Brooks watched the tactical display and counted the weapons aimed at them and decided he really hated this job sometimes. On the planet's surface, Jake met with Meridian leaders who were trying to evacuate civilians to underground shelters. They had maybe 3 weeks before the Zarakians attacked, maybe less if Thexval got impatient. The Meridian government had formally requested Earth's protection under the mutual aid treaties, but Helen's administration was still debating the legal implications. Jake wanted to scream that legal implications did not matter when millions of lives hung in the balance, but he kept his voice professional and made promises he was not sure Earth could keep. Marcus Stone intercepted a coded Zarakian transmission that made him immediately contact Admiral Williams. The message discussed something called Project Terminus and referenced captured Meridian technology. Marcus spent 2 days breaking the encryption, and what he found made him wish he had not. The Meridians had been developing clean energy technology that could theoretically be weaponized into planet-destroying bombs. The Zarakians had captured the research and were planning to use it not just against the Meridians, but against any species that opposed them. If they succeeded, the balance of power in the galaxy would shift permanently. Claire took Marcus's intelligence report directly to the president without going through normal channels. This was beyond border incidents and cultural genocide. This was an existential threat to every peaceful species in the galaxy. The Zarakians were not just conquering territory anymore. They were positioning themselves to dominate everyone through the threat of total destruction. Earth's neutrality had always been based on the assumption that other species would eventually find peaceful solutions. But what happened when one species decided that peace was for the weak and only total domination mattered? Kate Anderson watched another Zarakian patrol buzz, knew Geneva's outer markers, and felt her patience wearing thin. The patrols came twice a day now, and each time they flew closer and acted more aggressive. Yesterday they had painted the colony with targeting sensors for a full minute. Today they fired their engines at full burn while passing the agricultural domes, ruining 3 months of carefully grown crops with radiation wash. The colonists were getting scared and angry, and Kate could not blame them. Earth kept saying to trust in diplomacy, but diplomacy looked a lot like surrender from where they were. Standing, Amy Chen held a dying Meridian child in the medical bay and listened to him ask for his mother, who was already dead. The boy had been caught in a Zarakian bombardment of a civilian transport. The transport had been clearly marked as carrying refugees, and the Zarakians had destroyed it anyway. Amy did everything she could, but the injuries were too severe, and the child died quietly just after midnight. She sat there holding him for a long time, and something broke inside her. How many more children had to die before Earth stopped talking and started protecting the innocent? President Helen Martinez made her decision 3 days after receiving all the reports. She authorized the evacuation of all human personnel from the conflict zone and increased defensive readiness at the border colonies, but she maintained Earth's official neutrality. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some praised her consistency and moral courage. Others called her a coward who was abandoning allies to face genocide. Helen ignored both groups and focused on what she believed was right, even as she wondered if believing in something made it true. Supreme Commander Thex Val watched the human evacuation orders and laughed. Earth was running away and calling it policy. The Meridians would fall, and the humans would write sad reports about it, and the galaxy would learn once again that peace was a luxury only the strong could afford. The Zarakian fleet moved into attack position around the Meridian, homeworld, on a Tuesday morning. Dr. Nathan Ford watched the warships arrange themselves through the medical station's external cameras and knew that time had just run out. Amy Chen stood beside him, counting the ships and trying not to show how scared she was. They had been ordered to evacuate 3 days ago, but Nathan had refused to leave while patients still needed care. Amy had refused to leave Nathan. Now they were trapped with 3,000 Meridian civilians who were too sick or injured to be moved. The first bombardment started at dawn, and the planet's surface lit up with explosions. The Meridian Defense Force launched everything they had, but it was like throwing rocks at a tsunami. Zarakian destroyers picked off the defending ships one by one, while their larger vessels began systematically destroying military installations on the ground. Nathan tried to raise Earth's emergency channel, but the Zarakians were jamming all frequencies. The medical station was supposed to be protected under galactic law, but laws meant nothing when nobody was there to enforce them. Captain Jake Morrison's ship raced toward the Meridian system at maximum speed after picking up the distress signals. Lisa Hamilton worked frantically to cut through the jamming, while Ryan Brooks plotted emergency jump coordinates in case they needed to run. Jake had disobeyed direct orders to stay away from the conflict zone, because he could not sit safely in human space while people he knew were dying. The New Horizon was not a warship, but it had speed and diplomatic credentials, and Jake hoped that would be enough to at least evacuate the medical station. Commander Alex Turner received word of the attack while having breakfast with his daughter. She was visiting from Earth and had been asking him about the Zarakians all week. Alex had tried to keep his answers vague and reassuring, but now he turned on the news feed and they both watched the Meridian homeworld burn in real time. His daughter asked if Earth was going to help, and Alex did not know what to say. He kissed her forehead and told her he had to go to work. She was 16 and smart enough to know that her father was lying when he said everything would be okay. Kate Anderson activated New Geneva's defense protocols without waiting for authorization from Earth. The Zarakian fleet attacking the Meridians was 3 systems away, but she knew how this would play out. Once the meridians fell, the Zerakians would turn their attention to human colonies that had been helping refugees. New Geneva would be a target, and Kate was not going to wait until enemy ships were in orbit to start preparing. She began quietly moving civilians to the underground shelters and positioning her small security force at strategic points. If the Zerakians came here, they would find out that humans were not as soft as they looked. Admiral Claire Williams stood in Earth's military command center and watched multiple screens showing the destruction of the Meridian homeworld. She had admirals and generals around her asking for orders, and she had nothing to tell them because the president had not authorized military action. Claire had spent 30 years in the service, and she had never felt more useless than she did right now. Every instinct she had screamed to launch the fleet and stop the slaughter, but she was a soldier, and soldiers followed orders, even when those orders felt like murder by inaction. Nathan Ford moved through the medical station trying to keep his patients calm while the building shook from nearby explosions. The Zerakians were working their way through civilian centers now, and the medical station was clearly visible from orbit with its giant red cross markings. Amy Chen helped an elderly Meridian woman to a more secure area when the first direct hit struck the station's east wing. The lights flickered and alarms started screaming, and Nathan knew with terrible certainty that their protection under galactic law had just been revoked by weapons fire. Supreme Commander Thexval sat in his command ship and personally directed the attack on the medical station. One of his subordinates had questioned the wisdom of attacking a protected facility staffed by neutral humans, but Thexval had him removed from the bridge. The medical station was harboring enemies of the Zerakian Empire, and that made it a legitimate military target. Besides, he wanted to send a message to Earth about the price of interfering in Zerakian business. Let the humans see what happened when you stood between the Empire and its objectives. Jake Morrison's ship dropped out of hyperspace just in time to see the medical station's shields fail completely. Lisa screamed into the communication system, identifying the New Horizon as a human diplomatic vessel on a rescue mission, but the Zerakian ships did not even acknowledge the transmission. Ryan pulled up the tactical display and counted 16 Zerakian fighters moving into attack formation around the defenseless station. Jake pushed the engines to maximum and prayed they would get there in time, but he knew they would not. The universe had a cruel way of teaching lessons about the limits of good intentions. Nathan made the decision that Amy had been dreading. He ordered her to take the 10 patients who could walk and get them to the evacuation shuttles in the hangar bay. Amy refused, and Nathan grabbed her shoulders and looked into her eyes and told her that someone had to survive to tell Earth what happened here. Someone had to make sure the galaxy knew that the Zerakians had deliberately murdered a medical station full of refugees. Amy was crying and arguing, but Nathan was already pushing her toward the door. The last thing she saw before the corridor filled with smoke was Nathan turning back to the patients who could not be moved, choosing to stay with them until the end. The second wave of attacks hit the medical station with devastating precision. Zerakian fighters strafed the building with plasma cannons that melted through walls and floors. Nathan felt the heat before he felt the pain, and then he did not feel anything at all. 3,000 Meridian civilians died in the attack, along with Nathan and 6 other human medical staff who had stayed behind. Amy Chen made it to the shuttles with her small group of survivors and launched just as the station's fusion reactor went critical. She watched through the viewport as the building where she had worked for 3 years turned into a ball of expanding fire. Jake Morrison arrived 30 seconds after the medical station exploded, and for the first time in his career as a diplomat, he felt pure rage. Instead of measured consideration, Lisa was sobbing at her station, and Ryan was swearing in every language he knew, and Jake opened a channel to the Zerakian fleet. He identified himself and demanded to know why they had destroyed a protected medical facility. The response came from Supreme Commander Thexval himself, and his voice carried amusement rather than shame. The facility was harboring enemies, and Earth should have evacuated sooner. These things happened in war zones. Perhaps next time humans would know better than to interfere. President Helen Martinez received the report about the medical station while in a meeting with her cabinet. Someone handed her a data pad, and she read it twice because her brain refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. Nathan Ford was dead. Amy Chen had barely escaped. 3,000 civilians murdered. A protected medical facility deliberately destroyed. She set down the pad very carefully and looked at Admiral Claire Williams, and for the first time in her presidency, Helen's voice shook when she spoke. She asked Claire how fast the fleet could be ready for combat operations. Marcus Stone watched the intelligence feeds and saw something shift in the galactic communication networks. Species that had been neutral or sympathetic to the Zorakians suddenly started questioning the Empire's actions. The destruction of a human medical station was different from conquering enemy territory. Humans were supposed to be untouchable because they were neutral, because they helped everyone, because attacking Earth meant giving up any claim to legitimacy. The Zorakians had just crossed a line that even their allies thought was sacred, and the political calculations that kept the galaxy divided were starting to change. Kate Anderson received new orders from Earth, and these orders were very different from the previous ones. She was authorized to defend New Geneva by any means necessary. Earth's fleet was being mobilized and would arrive in the sector within 72 hours. All human colonies were ordered to prepare for possible conflict. Kate read the message 3 times and felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach. This was really happening. Earth was going to war. Amy Chen sat in the rescue shuttle surrounded by the handful of survivors she had managed to save, and could not stop seeing Nathan's face when he told her to run. The shuttle was picked up by Jake Morrison's ship, and Amy told him everything that had happened in a flat, dead voice that scared Jake more than any amount of crying would have. She described how the Zorakians had targeted the medical station deliberately, how they had ignored all the protection symbols, how they had laughed about it afterward. Jake recorded every word because Amy was right about one thing. The galaxy needed to know what happened here. Admiral Claire Williams addressed the assembled fleet commanders from Earth's military headquarters, and she did not waste time with speeches about duty or honor. She told them that humans had tried peace for 50 years and peace had gotten good people killed. She told them that the Zorakians had murdered civilians under Earth's protection and laughed about it. She told them that Earth's neutrality was official. The human fleet arrived at the Meridian homeworld exactly 48 hours after President Helen Martinez declared war, and the Zorakians had no idea what hit them. Admiral Claire Williams commanded from the flagship Liberty's call with Jake Morrison at her side, coordinating tactical communications. The fleet dropped out of hyperspace in a formation that made the Zorakian sensors scream warnings, but by the time they reacted, it was already too late. Human ships that had been classified as exploratory vessels suddenly revealed weapon systems that made Zorakian technology look like children's toys. The first salvo from the human fleet destroyed 6 Zorakian destroyers before their shields even finished powering up. Lisa Hamilton transmitted surrender terms on all frequencies, while Ryan Brooks managed the tactical display showing enemy positions. The Zorakians tried to return fire, but their targeting systems could not lock onto ships that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Earth had spent 50 years developing stealth technology and energy weapons, while everyone assumed they were just building peaceful research vessels. The galaxy's biggest mistake was thinking that humans who chose not to fight had forgotten how to fight. Supreme Commander Thex Val watched his fleet fall apart from his command ship and felt something he had not experienced in 20 years of conquest. Fear. His tactical officers were shouting reports about human ships appearing and disappearing and weapons that cut through Zorakian shields like they were not even there. He ordered a full retreat, but half his ships never received the command because human jamming technology was blocking their communications. The great Zorakian armada that had conquered worlds was being dismantled in minutes by a species they had dismissed as weak. On the Meridian homeworld surface, Ambassador Keth Knoll emerged from an underground shelter and watched the sky light up with human weapons fire. Meridian civilians gathered around him, pointing and crying with relief as Zorakian ships exploded or fled in disorder. Children who had grown up knowing only fear and oppression saw hope for the first time in their lives. Keth Knoll fell to his knees and wept because his people had been saved by the species everyone said would never fight for anyone. Commander Alex Turner watched the battle reports from New Geneva and felt something loosen in his chest. Earth had not abandoned them after all. Kate Anderson stood beside him in the command center, and they shared a look of grim satisfaction. The colonists who had questioned Earth's commitment were gathering in the streets celebrating, and Alex let them have this moment. They would need the memory of it for what was coming next because the Zorakians would not forget this humiliation. The rescue of Meridian survivors began immediately after the last Zorakian ships jumped away. Jake Morrison led teams down to the planet's surface, and what they found made even hardened soldiers struggle to maintain composure. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Families had been separated and enslaved. Cultural sites that had stood for thousands of years were now just burnt foundations. The Zerakians had not just conquered the Meridians, they had tried to erase them from existence. Ambassador Keth Knoll met Jake at what used to be the planetary government building. The Meridian looked like he had aged 20 years in the past month. His scales were dull and his eyes were haunted, but he was alive and his people were being freed. He thanked Jake with words that came from somewhere deep and broken, and Jake did not know what to say except that Earth should have come sooner. Keth Knoll shook his head and said that Earth had come when it mattered, and sometimes that was enough. Admiral Claire Williams did not celebrate the victory because she knew it was just the beginning. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. She reviewed the intelligence reports that Marcus Stone had compiled about Zerakian territory and felt the scope of what Earth had just committed to. The Zerakian Empire controlled 47 systems and had enslaved populations on 32 worlds. Earth had just declared that all of those people would be freed, and that was a promise that would require years of fighting to keep the galaxy's reaction to Earth's first battle was shock, followed by frantic recalculation of every political and military assumption. Species that had dismissed humans as irrelevant suddenly wanted to know where Earth had hidden its military capabilities. Former Zerakian allies quietly began distancing themselves from the Empire. Neutral species started reaching out to Earth asking about mutual defense treaties. The balance of power that had held for decades was shifting, and everyone was scrambling to figure out what it meant. President Helen Martinez addressed Earth's population and all human colonies with a message that was both celebration and warning. The rescue of the Meridian homeworld was important, but it was only the first step. Earth was now committed to a campaign that would free every species suffering under Zerakian occupation. This would not be easy or quick or without cost, but it was the right thing to do, and Earth would see it through to the end. She asked for patience and sacrifice and trust that humanity's cause was just. The response from across human space was overwhelming support, because people had been waiting for Earth to stand up for something bigger than neutrality. Supreme Commander Thex Val returned to Zerakian space and immediately began planning his revenge. He had underestimated the humans and paid for it, but he would not make that mistake again. The Empire had resources and ships and subject species that could be forced into service. Earth might have won one battle, but the Zerakians had been fighting wars for centuries, and they knew how to grind down an enemy through attrition and ruthlessness. He sent orders to all occupied territories to increase security and prepare for human attacks. Any hint of rebellion would be crushed immediately and completely. Kate Anderson received new orders assigning New Geneva as a forward operating base for human military operations. Cargo ships began arriving with equipment and personnel that transformed the peaceful colony into a staging area for liberation campaigns. Kate coordinated the expansion while dealing with colonists who had mixed feelings about their home becoming a military installation. She understood their concerns, but also knew that New Geneva's location made it strategically vital. The colony had survived by hiding its defensive capabilities, and now those capabilities were being brought into the open and expanded. Jake Morrison was reassigned from diplomatic duties to tactical coordination, and the change suited him perfectly. He had spent years trying to negotiate with species that only understood force, and now he could finally speak their language. His knowledge of alien psychology and culture made him valuable for planning operations that would minimize civilian casualties while maximum damage to Zerakian military assets. Lisa Hamilton and Ryan Brooks stayed with him, forming a team that combined communication expertise with tactical analysis. They worked 16-hour days planning the liberation campaigns that would free dozens of worlds. Marcus Stone uncovered intelligence that changed Earth's entire strategic approach. The Zerakians had not just been conquering species for territory or resources. They had been systematically stealing technology from every civilization they destroyed and combining it into their own weapons development. Some of the ships in the Zerakian fleet used engines stolen from the Vorlani people, who had been extinct for 15 years. The targeting systems came from the Helax, whose homeworld was now a Zerakian colony. Every victory the Empire achieved was built on the corpses of species they had erased from history. Admiral Claire Williams used Marcus's intelligence to plan a campaign that would hit the Zerakians where it hurt most. Earth would not just free occupied worlds. They would reclaim the stolen technology and return it to surviving members of the species it belonged to. The campaign would serve as both military strategy and moral statement. Earth was not here to conquer or claim territory. Earth was here to restore what the Zorakians had taken and give enslaved peoples their freedom and dignity back. The first liberation mission targeted a world called Turthan 5, where the Helax population had been enslaved for 8 years. Commander Alex Turner led the ground assault with Kate Anderson commanding the security forces. They dropped through Zorakian defenses using stealth shuttles and hit 3 major installations simultaneously. The Zorakian garrison was expecting subject populations to remain passive and was completely unprepared for armed resistance backed by human special forces. The battle lasted 6 hours, and when it was over, Turthan 5 was free. Kate walked through the liberated slave camps and tried not to show how angry she was. The Helax people were thin and scarred, and their eyes held the kind of emptiness that came from years of brutality. Human medics began treating the freed slaves, while translators explained that Earth was here to help, not to replace one master with another. The Helax did not believe it at first because they had learned that promises from powerful species always came with strings attached. But when human ships began leaving orbit after ensuring the planet was secure, when Earth offered aid without demanding anything in return, the Helax started to understand that something new was happening in the galaxy. Ambassador Keth Knoll traveled with the Liberation Fleet, serving as a bridge between humans and the species being freed. His presence helped convince suspicious populations that Earth's intentions were genuine. The Liberation Campaign reached 23 worlds in 4 months, and each victory made the next one easier, because enslaved populations stopped waiting for Earth to arrive and started fighting back on their own. Commander Alex Turner coordinated resistance movements across a dozen systems, teaching former slaves how to sabotage Zorakian equipment and disrupt supply lines. Kate Anderson trained local security forces so freed worlds could defend themselves after human ships moved on to the next target. Earth was not building an empire. They were building a network of independent allies who shared a common enemy and a common cause. Jake Morrison became the face of Earth's diplomatic outreach to species that had spent years under Zorakian control. He traveled from world to world explaining that freedom meant making your own choices, including the choice to refuse human help, if that was what they wanted. Some species were suspicious and some were grateful, and some were just confused by the idea that the powerful liberators would actually leave when asked. But Jake's message stayed consistent. Earth wanted nothing except to see justice restored and peoples freed. The galaxy was not used to conquerors who acted like this, and it changed everything. About how the war was perceived, Admiral Claire Williams planned the final phase of the campaign from her headquarters on the Liberty's call. Intelligence. Reports showed that Supreme Commander Thexval had consolidated his remaining forces around the Zorakian homeworld and was preparing for a desperate last stand. The Empire's subject populations had either rebelled or been liberated, and the once mighty fleet was reduced to maybe 200 ships. Claire knew she could destroy those forces in a direct assault, but the cost in lives would be enormous. She wanted to give the Zorakians one last chance to surrender with dignity intact. President Helen Martinez recorded a message that was broadcast across the entire Zorakian Empire. She spoke directly to the Zorakian people, not their leaders. She explained that Earth had no quarrel with ordinary Zorakians who just wanted to live their lives in peace. The war was against an imperial system that had brought suffering to dozens of species, including the Zorakians themselves, who had been forced to fight and die for conquests that only benefited their rulers. Helen offered terms that were almost impossibly generous: complete surrender of military forces, transition to democratic self-governance, reparations paid to freed species, and in exchange, Earth would guarantee Zorakian security and help rebuild their economy. The message ended with a simple statement. The choice was theirs to make. Supreme Commander Thexval heard Helen's message and knew his empire was finished. His subordinates were already talking about surrender in whispers they thought he could not hear. The subject populations that had made the empire strong were gone. The fleet that had conquered worlds was barely enough to defend one system. He could order a final battle that would kill thousands on both sides, or he could accept that the Zorakians had finally met an enemy they could not defeat. Thexval had spent his entire life believing that strength was everything and weakness was death, but Earth had proven that mercy could be stronger than cruelty and justice could win against oppression. The Zerakian government arrested Supreme Commander Thexval 3 days after Helen's broadcast. His own officers turned on him because they wanted to save their families and their homeworld from destruction. The new Zerakian leadership contacted Admiral Claire Williams and agreed to all of Earth's terms without trying to negotiate better conditions. The empire that had terrorized the galaxy for generations surrendered completely and asked only that their people be treated fairly. Claire accepted the surrender and ordered the fleet to stand down. The war was over. Kate Anderson stood on New Geneva watching the celebration in the streets and felt exhausted relief. The colony had transformed from a peaceful settlement to a military base, and now it could become peaceful again. Families who had been separated during the war were reuniting. Businesses that had closed were reopening. Children were playing outside without fear of Zerakian patrols. Kate thought about all the colonies across human space that were experiencing the same relief and felt proud of what Earth had accomplished. Jake Morrison attended the formal surrender ceremony on the Zerakian homeworld as Earth's diplomatic representative. He watched former Imperial officers hand over their weapons and their command codes to human peacekeepers. The Zerakian civilians who gathered to watch were scared and uncertain about the future. Jake gave a short speech promising that Earth had not come to punish them, but to help them build a better government that served all Zerakians instead of just the military elite. Some in the crowd believed him and some did not, but everyone was grateful that the speech was about rebuilding instead of revenge. Ambassador Keth Knoll returned to the Meridian homeworld and found it almost unrecognizable from the devastated planet he had left months before. Human engineers had helped rebuild critical infrastructure. Meridian artists were already creating new works to replace what had been destroyed. Children were going to school and learning about their history instead of having it erased. The scars would take generations to heal, but the Meridian people had survived, and they would make sure future generations remembered both the horror of what happened and the hope that came after. Marcus Stone compiled a comprehensive report on the Zerakian Empire's crimes, and the evidence was overwhelming. The report documented 43 genocides, hundreds of thousands of war crimes, and the complete destruction of 7 different civilizations. The report was presented to a new galactic council that Earth helped establish. The council voted to hold trials for Zerakian war criminals, while ensuring that ordinary Zerakians who had just followed orders were given the chance to prove they could be peaceful citizens. Justice would be served, but it would be justice tempered with mercy. Admiral Claire Williams oversaw the transition from wartime operations to peacekeeping and found that peace was almost harder than war. Earth now had obligations to dozens of freed species and commitments to help rebuild societies that had been shattered. The fleet that had liberated worlds now protected trade routes and provided humanitarian assistance. Claire worked with President Helen to create a new defensive alliance based on voluntary membership and mutual protection. Any species could join if they agreed to democratic governance and rejected aggressive warfare. The alliance grew quickly as more species realized that Earth's protection came without strings attached. President Helen Martinez stepped down from office 6 months after the war ended. She gave a farewell speech explaining that wartime leadership should not extend into peacetime governance. She had made the difficult choice to end Earth's neutrality, and she had guided humanity through a war that changed the galaxy. But now it was time for someone else to guide Earth through the peace that followed. Her final words as president were a warning that freedom required constant vigilance and the willingness to defend it when necessary. Earth had learned that lesson at terrible cost and must never forget it. The memorial for Dr. Nathan Ford and Amy Chen was built on the Meridian homeworld at the site where the medical station had been destroyed. The memorial included the names of every person who died in the war, both human and alien. The inscription that Kate Anderson helped write read simply, "They chose the wrong enemy, but in doing so gave the galaxy its freedom." Thousands of beings from dozens of species visited the memorial every year to remember and to promise that such sacrifices would not be needed again. Jake Morrison accepted promotion to admiral and took command of Earth's diplomatic fleet. His mission was to help the new Galactic Council function effectively and to mediate disputes before they became conflicts. Lisa Hamilton and Ryan Brooks stayed with him, forming a team that combined combat experience with diplomatic skill. They traveled across the galaxy helping newly freed Species adjust to independence and teaching them that democracy was messy and difficult, but worth the effort, Commander. Alex Turner returned to New Geneva and resumed his role as colonial administrator. The colony had proven during the war that frontier settlements could defend themselves if necessary, but now it was time to remember why they had been established in the first place. New Geneva went back to being a center for trade and research and culture. Alex watched ships from dozens of species dock at the station and felt satisfied that Earth had fought not to dominate but to protect this kind of peaceful cooperation. The former Zarakian Empire completed its transition to democratic governance 5 years after the surrender. The new Zarakian Republic held its first free elections and chose leaders who promised to make amends for the crimes committed in their name. Many Zarakians struggled with their history and their identity, but they also showed remarkable ability to change when given the chance. Earth maintained a small peacekeeping force in Zarakian space, but every year it grew smaller as the Zarakians proved they could police themselves. Ambassador Kethnol lived to see his great-grandchildren grow up in a free meridian society that flourished under its own governance. He never forgot the dark days when his people faced extinction, or the moment when Earth's fleet appeared in the sky like angels of salvation. In his final years, he wrote a history of the war that became required reading across the galaxy. The book,